Mujtaba Rahman, Eurasia Group's Managing Director for Europe. Good to see you. This conference is getting underway, and obviously front and center on the main stage are big global conflicts, but there are a lot of political issues to contend with right here on the European continent. I want to unpack some of those with you. But anyway, let's start with politics. The EU Parliament has a big election coming in June. Set the stage for us politically in Europe.
So the concern has been the performance of populist parties, both at the national level but also in Brussels. They're set to perform very well. The vote will take place between the 6th to the 9th of June, and that will upend the centrist consensus that has enabled von der Leyen to govern over the course of the last 5 years. Our view, Eurasia Group's view, is yes, you will see the outperformance of populist parties. They will certainly be better represented in the next legislature at the European level. But that being said, the impacts on policy will be marginal at best. You will see a bit more pressure on the environment as the EU tries to legislate to implement the 2050 net zero commitment. A lot of the work for 2030 has already been legislated. There may be some more pressure on migration. There may be some pressure on the question of Ukraine's ultimate accession to the EU, but we don't think there'll be major dramatic policy impact. And the reason for that, Tony, the biggest reason for that is von der Leyen's legislative majority will still be drawn from centrist parties. Centre-right, centre-left, Renew, Emmanuel Macron's party, and the Greens. And those four parties together will still afford her a fairly comfortable, a diminished but still fairly comfortable legislative majority.
It's obviously been a difficult couple of years for growth of the global GDP, many countries experiencing some economic woes. Germany, interestingly enough, just surpassed Japan to become the world's third biggest economy, yet what I've been hearing here is a bit of a darker picture of what's actually happening. What's the reality, not just in Germany, but across the EU?
The reality is bleak. Today, the European Commission has revised down its growth forecasts, both for this and next year, from around 1.2-1.3% to 0.8-0.9%. That's a combination of higher interest rates, ongoing inflationary pressures, and you mustn't forget the fact Germany, for political and institutional reasons, was driven into a fiscal tightening this year. They've had to cut 17 billion from their budget because of a constitutional court ruling. And the speculation here, talking to various members of the German Bundestag and others, is the magnitude, the size of the hole Germany will need to fill next year is in the order of 40 to 50 billion euros. That's 1.5% of German GDP. And so the overall outlook, the overall picture, not just in Europe, also the UK, it was announced today, was in technical recession last year as a result of flatlining growth. The overall picture, I think, economically is an economy really in the doldrums, not performing, basically flat. I think this will be a major part of the next European Commission's mandate. At the June European Council, there'll be a strategic discussion among EU leaders with a view to picking up this thread and hopefully European leaders doing something meaningful over the course of the next 5 years. I'm a bit more sceptical. There's not a lot of money to go around, and if there isn't money, countries are really constrained in terms of what they can do to really enhance and boost their growth potential.
You mentioned discussions around Ukraine's ascension to EU membership. I'm wondering if, in fact, a partitioned Ukraine happens, is that viewed as a victory for Putin, and does that matter as much as it did to the continent 2 years ago?
So, Tony, you'll know Eurasia Group's base case and Eurasia Group's top risk. One of our top risks for the year is partitioned Ukraine. Right? Ukraine is not being given the weapons it needs to wage a successful war against Putin and reclaim its territory. There's obviously the headwinds of the US presidential election, and regardless of which way that goes, there is clearly tougher political support. Political support is getting tougher in Congress around provision of aid to Ukraine. So I do think the base case, certainly for us and many people, is a partition. Now, whether or not that's a success for Ukraine or for Putin, I would argue, depends on what it comes with. If at the Washington summit this year, NATO, 75th anniversary, there is a clear commitment to absorb Ukraine into NATO if there is an accelerated pathway for Ukraine to join the EU. And so the price of Ukraine having to concede parts of its territory is ultimate fundamental Western military, economic and political integration into NATO and the European Union, then that's an overall picture that I think is slightly less bleak. The final determination will depend on what the settlement looks like and what Zelensky and Ukraine ultimately secure as part of that final package that I think will only come together in the context of a negotiation, probably towards the end of this year or next year.
Now, you mentioned the summertime summit, the 75th NATO gathering. President Biden has already said Ukraine will not be on the agenda. However, we know there are other members, particularly the Baltics, Maciulis being a leading voice there, who are pushing harder for that. What is the power dynamic happening on the European continent? Are those voices that are still most concerned about Russia having any sway at all?
I mean, they certainly have moral sway. They do exercise a degree of political influence. If you look at the reluctance in countries like Germany and France to move as aggressively as they ultimately did do, I think a large part of that dynamic was because of this pressure from Central and Eastern European states. We've had a change of power in Poland. That's unleashed a completely new dynamic. We have a very credible leader, former European Council President, Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who will absolutely be pushing hard for more solidarity over Ukraine. But I think at the moment the focus is less on the ultimate NATO question and more on these interim bilateral security guarantees that are being committed to Ukraine. This is not to fight this war, this is to prepare Ukraine for the next war. And there's a debate really about whether those guarantees are a stepping stone to NATO, a complement to NATO, a substitute for NATO. And we may get more clarity on that debate at the Munich conference over the next few days as well.
I spoke to the conference CEO, Benedikt Franke, yesterday, and he admitted the elephant in the room, certainly one of the elephants in the room, is Donald Trump. I'm just wondering, here on the continent and in the UK where you live, what are you hearing in terms of concerns, fear, or is it being overblown by the media?
No, I mean, there is huge concern, and I suspect the concern will only grow over time as the election campaign intensifies, as the race with Biden is close, and as Trump feels he needs to say what he needs to say to the base to deliver him this victory. And so I suspect his rhetoric on the campaign is only going to escalate and will make people on this side of the Atlantic incredibly nervous. I think there is still a lot of concern. Is Trump really transactional? Is this really about 2% of GDP? Or is he fundamentally ambivalent about America being the guarantor of European security? The problem, of course, is this stuff is based on trust. And ambivalent signals by Trump about his commitment, of course, do invite the Russians, the Chinese, and others to potentially probe this new equilibrium. And that's where I think the concern rests. You know, is this a transaction, or if this is something much less tangible, something based on trust, is Trump signaling an invitation to Russia and others to probe and to test? And that's really where the concern lies. And I don't think we'll necessarily have an answer to that question, but that's where the concern is.
Midge, thanks so much as always. Follow him on X. I almost said Twitter. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.